Hello all, Lydia here. Welcome. I recently did a poll on my community feed and was pleased to find that you all wanted a summer dress. I've been wanting to make a dress like this since last summer, so using my pattern blocks, I drafted a pattern, a corset top with gathered cups, and an A-line skirt. I made a toile from this in the rest of my bedsheet fabric from last week's make. I made some adjustments and then cut and sewed the final in this gorgeous linen fabric, which I bought 4 years ago actually. Finally, it has realized its potential. If you enjoy my vibe, like and subscribe. Don't forget to ring the bell and comment as well. Let's get this started, shall we? To make this dress, you want about 2 yards of shell fabric. I used 2 yards of this linen and 1.5 yards of fabric for the lining. You'll want some lightweight fusible interfacing, an 18-inch zipper, some boning, and about a yard of elastic. The pattern consists of 2 front panels with cutouts for the bust, cups which will be gathered, and 2 panels for the back. You need a sleeve that will be gathered and the skirt pieces. The front piece has a seam to the side for a leg slit, and the back has 2 separate pieces to allow for zipper right in the center back. In addition, you need 2 1.25 inch by 16-inch strips for the front bust ties and 2 bias strips that are 1.75 inches by the length of your sleeve cap from notch to notch plus some. All of these pieces are also cut in lining fabric. The skirt can be shortened 2 inches for the lining. The seam allowance is pretty much 1/2 inch everywhere. I will release a tutorial for how to draft the pattern next week, and I will link it below. Start by cutting out all of your pieces. I like to cut the largest pieces first and then the smaller pieces. I think this is the best way to cut. That way, if you make a mistake with the larger pieces, you still have a lot more fabric to work with and you can fill in the gaps with the smaller pieces. I actually didn't use all 2 yards of my shell fabric. I had a little over 1/2 yard left over. I applied fusible interfacing to all of my bodice pieces, especially because the fabrics were different. My lining fabric was a bit heavier and more stiff than the linen, so it helps to make the linen more robust. Everything is cut, let's sew. Start by prepping your bust ties. Instead of sewing a tube, I'm using a bias tape maker to fold the strip of fabric, then I sew it down. This is a trick I learned in a past sewing job. Fold up one end of each strip and sew to finish. Take your front bodice piece and with right sides together, sew the panels. I cut the center lining piece with seam allowance so that I can put boning in the center. For the shell, I press open the seams and sew them down with a nice top stitch on either side of the seam. With the lining, I fold the seam allowance to one side and sew a casing for the boning. My boning is only 1/4 inch. If yours is thicker, you'll need bigger seam allowance. For the back, we are going to repeat the same steps as we did for the front. Then place front and back right sides together at the side seam and sew. Treat these seams exactly as you did for all the other panel seams. Cut your boning 1/8 inch shy of the seam allowance. So since my seam allowance is 1/2 inch, I'm cutting 5/8 at the top and bottom of the boning. This just ensures that you're not going to break a needle on the boning as you sew. Then slide the boning into each seam, including the side seam and center front. Also, just a tip, you can go to the dollar store or the hardware store and get a pack of zip ties, and that will work really nicely for boning. Sew up all 4 cups at center front up to the notch, or about halfway up from the bottom. Press open the seam. Then sew a double row of large stitches between the notches. Basically, you want to concentrate your gathers toward the front, not to the side of your bust. It's just more flattering this way. Gather your cups to the size of the bodice. Then place right sides together on the bodice and sew. I've removed a 1/2 inch of the stitches at the base of the center seam so that I can properly apply it to the point of the center bodice panel. You will pivot at this point when sewing. Then sew. Next, place the shell and lining right sides together, and I almost forgot, but you also need to add the bust ties into the seam here. You want to place them 3/4 of an inch down from the top to make room for the ruffle. Instead of using this tie as a drawstring, we're going to actually use it just as a tie and insert elastic, which will be much more secure and comfortable. It'll all make sense when you see it. Sew across the top of the back bodice, skip the armhole, then sew across the top of the bust, ending in the center. And you'll see how I caught the tie in the center front seam. Next, I like to understitch on the lining side. Understitching just means stitching the seam allowance to the lining 1/16 away from the seam. On the inside, in the exact same spot as the tie, attach a 6 or 7 inch piece of 1/4 inch elastic. And now we are going to create a casing for the elastic. This is definitely a more complex way of doing it. We could just sew some soft elastic on the lining side, but I wanted a very clean finish inside, so I went with this method. Sew a 1/2 inch from the top of the bust cup. This is the ruffle portion. Next, push the elastic toward the stitch and stitch beside the elastic to create the elastic casing. I use the zipper foot to get close. When you're sewing, once you've sewn a little ways, reach inside and pull the elastic, and then keep sewing. Pin your elastic right away at the opening so that it doesn't shrink back inside, causing you to have to unpick stitches to get it back out. Then you can try this on and see how tight you want the elastic. I ended up using about 5 inches of the elastic and cutting off the rest. Secure the elastic with a stitch and then serge the entire armhole. Place your sleeve shell and lining right sides together and sew the bottom seam. The sleeve doesn't really need a lining piece. I just did it because my shell fabric is kind of flimsy and I wanted a nice puffy sleeve that would hold up, so lining it with my cotton bedsheet fabric really helped add structure to it. You can understitch this bottom seam as well, then iron flat and mark up 1 inch for your ruffle, and sew a pair of stitches 3/8 of an inch apart for the elastic. Then I use a loop turner to pull through the elastic. Secure the elastic to a length that will sit comfortably at your bicep. Overlock the side seams and the underarm seams slightly beyond the notches to prepare to insert the sleeve. Next, I'm taking my bias strips, which I have folded and ironed on one side and both ends. You could also just overlock them instead of folding them over. Place the raw edge along the cap of the sleeve 1.5 inches past each notch. Then sew a 1/4 inch. Understitch this as well. With right sides together, sew up the underarm seams. You can turn up the edges of the seam and stitch a little triangle for a cleaner look. Next, apply the sleeve to the bodice. I realized that I could hide some of the seam of the armhole by unpicking the bias tape and resewing it on top, so that's what I did. Now sew the folded edges of the bias tape to the sleeve. Then do another stitch 3/8 of an inch away for your elastic casing. Feed the elastic in with your loop turner, or you could use a safety pin as well. I recommend trying it on to make sure you get a nice snug fit. Then secure your elastic ends with a stitch. We are now done the bodice. At this point, you could actually sew a little ruffle to the hem and add a separating zipper in the back, and it becomes a cute corset top. I definitely want to try this. If you want me to do another tutorial with just a top and maybe a less complex construction, let me know in the comments. Take your 2 front skirt pieces for the shell and lining. Make sure that your slit is to be sewn on the opposite side on your lining piece. Place the panels right sides together and sew to whatever height you want your slit. Iron open these seams and then place the 2 back panels right sides together to the front and sew. Press these seams open as well. Then with your bodice open and separated, sew the skirt lining to the bodice lining and the skirt shell to the bodice shell. Make sure you match the seams on the skirt to the bodice seams. The slit seam lines up with the front bodice panel seam, and the side seams line up with the bodice side seams. Sew. And there it is, all sewn together. To apply the invisible zipper, place the right side of the zipper to the right side of just your shell. I sewed a stitch along the zipper tape just to keep it in place. Then I used my invisible zipper foot to sew as close to the teeth as possible. I placed the zipper tape 1/8 of an inch away from the edge so that my stitch would be right on the 1/2 inch seam allowance of the dress. To make sure I line up the waist seam on each side, I mark the unsewn zipper tape. Line up the other side of the zipper to the other side of the dress and sew it. Finish by sewing up the rest of the skirt back. Finally, apply the lining to the shell along the zipper, using a zipper foot to get close to the teeth. In the same way as the shell, sew up the remainder of the skirt lining. To complete the slit, line up the opening of the shell and lining. Then face each side of the slit right sides together and sew to clean finish it. Leave a 1-inch gap from the end of the lining. Now hem the shell and lining separately. After this, you're going to close up the gap that you left at the end of the lining hem. You can understitch the slit at this point. It will help keep the lining from popping out while wearing it. And to finish the raw edges of the shell, I fold over the edge twice, and you can machine stitch this, or like I did, do a blind stitch so that it doesn't show on the face of the fabric. Do a final press of the hems and slit. Seam any wrinkly parts of the skirt. And it's ready to wear. Here is the inside view of the dress. And here is the outside view of the dress. Time to put it on and frolic among the flowers. It's spring back